This is going to be the last video in my discrimination story, not because there are not plenty of more incidents for me to go into detail on, but because going back into those details is very emotional for me and essentially keeps me in the place that I was in when all of this was going on. And 6 months after I left the company, I am finally ready to move on with my life, to move forward with my life. I've realized I do not want the changing point in my life and something that I do, in fact, believe put me on a different path to also be the defining moment of my life. And so this channel is going to switch to one that focuses on what it's like to rebuild a company when you're still dealing with this trauma. So there will still be discussion on what happened to me, but it'll be more about where I am at this moment rather than where I was when the discrimination was ongoing. But to first wrap up the story for those that have been following, I will just quickly wrap up what happened and how everything played out leading up into my departure. Essentially, once I knew that discrimination was, or once I believed I knew that discrimination was happening, I did nothing because I didn't think anyone would care until layoffs happened in February 2023. At that time, we had three female specialists. Two who one was actually on leave, but the other two were active in the field, had already, finished their ramp and were doing very well. And they were both selected for layoffs. This was upsetting to me because of the fact that we already had limited diversity across the specialist team. Most of them were white and male. And I didn't understand how all three women could be selected for layoffs, especially the two that were in the field and had both or had outperformed some of the males that remained. They had longer tenure than some of the males that remained. They lived in the same location as as a male who did not perform as well as them, but had been kept on. And essentially I spent the next 3 weeks just trying to make sense of it, trying to understand like how could they have been selected, because everybody will tell you you can't do anything about layoffs, even if there is discrimination, because it's just layoffs, it's so many people or whatnot. But for me, I just kept coming back to it and thinking there's just no way it was chance that both of these women were selected, and the woman that was on FMLA. So essentially, representation had dropped from 22% to 8%. And I stewed on it for 3 weeks, lost sleep, didn't eat, did not know what to do. And the truth is, it's because I knew it would blow up the rest of my career. And I was terrified. I didn't want to blow up the rest of my career. I spent my entire life building my career. But I basically looked at myself in the mirror and I questioned, is this the defining point? Is this where women like my VP, who was willing to look the other way or just say this is how it is this the defining point that sets you on that path that you never turn back away from? And do I want to be that person? And I didn't want to be that person. I wanted to be the type of woman who lifted others up, who said something when something wasn't right, who stood up for others. I had always envisioned myself as climbing the corporate ladder, at least in part so I could bring other people with me. And so I knew that if at this moment I chose to do differently, what would change next time? It would probably be easier to do it again. And so I did the right thing. When I went to HR, when I broke down, I broke out down at a sales kickoff. It was an on-site, and I broke down to the female VP who I was still going to at this point. And I let her know about the video, and I let her know my concerns about the layoffs. This was when I learned that she actually had a part in the decision about the layoffs. And I remember just really being shocked because I didn't understand how, as a woman, she could not have recognized the impact that would have to representation. But, I asked you what were the reasons. I was given a very subjective reason for one of them, that did not seem fair. Essentially, actually, I'm not going to go into the details, but essentially it felt very subjective to me. For the other one, the one who reported to me, I was told it was about performance. And the problem with that is that as her manager, I had certainly not given that feedback about her performance. And so I wasn't sure where this negative feedback about performance was coming from. That being said, regardless, we were not going to agree on whether or not there was a problem with the layoffs, but she did agree there was a problem with the video and helped me get in contact with HR. I had my interview with HR the following week. At that point, I gave them something like 5 or 6 pages of evidence, all incidents outlined, plus the 2 prior escalations I had made to leadership in HR. And essentially I waited. They let me know a couple weeks later they were going to investigate. And it was at that point that I first raised concerns about promotions and raises. And I specifically said I had concerns that there would be some bias and discrimination in the upcoming promotion cycle. And I referenced the fact that there had been multiple men who had been elevated into higher positions following the layoffs for roles that women weren't considered for. I won't get into all the details, but I will say one of the things that I did highlight was that my team lead, my former team lead, had gotten a role as a not just a manager, he'd actually skipped over me to become a senior manager, but had not been required to interview. Whereas I had had to go through 7 interviews, and so this seemed confusing. Um, I don't have anything against my team lead succeeding. Like, I wanted him to succeed. It was more that I didn't understand the discrepancy between fairness and why, those of us that had to do all of these interviews had been held to a different standard than he had for a role that seemed to have been carved out for him. But I raised these concerns, I sent them everything, and I actually never heard back from that email. Like, I just did not get a response. So when there were some other little things, I'm just going to skip over those, but basically the next big thing comes when promotion cycle happens. And I I had been told previously by my director that I would be promoted, and I was suddenly told that I was not selected for promotion. First, I was told it was budget. I asked why budget had been a constraint for me, but had not been a constraint for every other specialist manager who had been made senior. And I was told it was because things were going to be different under the male VP than they were under the female VP, though at the time I did not understand this. And then when I asked for specific feedback, because I wanted to understand the reason why I was held back from being promoted when my peers were, I was told it was because of the fact that I had raised concerns in September of 2022 about the role change. And I was told it was because I was high strung. When I asked, essentially what he meant by that, like I asked for specific behaviors that indicated to him that I was high strung. He said that sometimes I have a lot of energy, which can be a good thing, but people are like, whoa. And then when I asked for constructive feedback for how to improve, because I still did not know what to do with that, I was told I should celebrate more and make less noise. And at that point, I knew there was no point in doing anything because I had already tried to raise concerns to HR. They clearly had not asked any questions. And as a result, I was clearly going to not probably have a path forward to correction. At the end of that call, he told me about another woman who was upset, who was not promoted, and said that she had requested me as a mentor. I'm not going to get into all the details about how I found out this information, but I then found out later that she was not promoted because of not having enough confidence, which essentially is also equally subjective. And when I challenged that, because I had mentored her previously, I was basically told she had improved since then. She was ready to be promoted, but she hadn't asked for the promotion. So I asked if the male had asked for the promotion on that same team, and he said no. And this was the manager, not the director. Though the director is the one who told me why she was upset about not being promoted. It was the manager who eventually told me this. And here's the thing, that manager, I genuinely don't think that he intended to let subjectivity impact his promotion decisions. I knew him. I worked with him for years. I think he was a decent person, but this is what happens when you don't have checks and balances in place, when leadership fails to ask questions, when there's no looking around to see if women are disproportionately being held back for subjective reasons. And that was when I knew that even though I had specifically gone to HR and said, I have concerns, they did nothing. And I knew I was alone. So that's when I knew I needed to get a lawyer. The first lawyer I contacted told me to contact him when I get fired. So that was nice. But I figured out a better way to reframe it, which is kind of what Just a Proof is based on. I figured out a better way to reframe the conversation so that I could get through to a lawyer. And once I was clear about what had happened in terms of pay violations, promotion, the promotion being withheld, and the disproportionate pay, plus all the evidence I had, I was able to retain a representation from a large law firm. I thought things would move quickly at that point. They did not. Instead, when my lawyer sent out notification to my company that I was represented, they the company reposted a video that had been recorded 7 months prior or longer, talking about why I had returned to the company and a cryptic message about, leaving on good terms, which maybe was coincidence, certainly felt retaliatory, but regardless. From there, not a whole lot changed, and that was probably something that really surprised me. I thought once you got a lawyer, things would move quickly, but I realized now. I found out about the arbitration agreement at this point. That was when I realized, my options to go to court were limited, and I was horrified to realize my civil rights weren't protected as I thought they were. But essentially, I worked with the lawyer over the next several months, building out the demand letter, getting ready for mediation, doing all of those things, and then throughout this time, I am currently reporting to that same director. I am being left out of offsites that don't make sense to leave me off of. I am being excluded from meetings. I actually am not even having one-on-ones anymore. So essentially, I am just operating by myself. And the ironic thing is that my team is still crushing their numbers. We are still doing very, very well because nobody had any idea what was going on. I would essentially cry, wash my face, and get on a meeting and pretend like everything was fine for months. The breaking point, though, and I was under the care of a psychiatrist, we were increasingly upping my antidepressants as I was dealing with this retaliation, dealing with this just uncomfortable feeling every day, and this dread of not knowing what was going to happen week to week. And luckily, I did have an ally. I had another woman who came forward, who went to HR. I had really great relationships, which I am incredibly grateful for because I could not have done it without these people. But they essentially left me reporting to him. And in the end of July, I found out that he was going to get to review me again. And I found out because he wanted to meet with me to review my team and see how they were doing. And so I messaged the HR business partner, and I asked her if this also meant that my director was going to get to review me. And she said yes. And she said, of course, we'll factor in other factors because of the fact of what's going on. And I lost it. I also found out that my director, who would typically have gone to an offsite on the East Coast the following week when teams got together, was actually going to be on the West Coast, and nobody even bothered to tell me. I had a 6-month HR investigation going on, and no one thought to tell me that this man was going to be there. I guess they were just going to let me walk in and see him sitting at the lunch table, dinner table, whatever the reservation was that allowed me to find out he was going to be there. And between that and finding out he was going to get to evaluate me again, I got on a one-on-one. And at this point, no one had any idea what was going on. I had held it together. I'd been so strong. And I got on that one-on-one and I just broke down. I didn't tell him what was going on. I just simply said, I'm so sorry. This is so unprofessional. I have something personal going on. I really cannot, do this right now. Can we reschedule? And I went on FMLA that day. My psychiatrist wanted me to go on FMLA for 2 months. I was dumb. I was so dumb. I wanted to prove to somebody, I don't even know who I was proving anything to, that I was stronger than this. So I came back after a month. But during that month, my director was finally terminated. Now, the ironic thing about this is I mentioned the video that was sent in part 3. I told them about that video in February. They interviewed the woman who received the video in April. They interviewed her, but she went on maternity leave. And then they interviewed her again in July. And it was not until July that they asked for the video. This means that they could have done something earlier and they didn't. They either did not feel it was warranted. They did not have the time. They didn't think about it. I don't know. I'll never know. All I know is that they made me suffer irreparable harm for no reason. And I don't know what's wrong with them. And I refuse to take that back. Like, I genuinely think they're terrible people, but that's my opinion. Anyways, this director was let go. Shortly after, I realized that things were off with my female VP. Actually, I'd realized things were off with my female VP because when my director told me I was not promoted because I was high strung, I actually asked her about it. I asked her if she was part of the decision, and she allowed me to believe that she had not been part of the decision, even though she had led our team the previous year, but rather that it was another male VP that had influenced the decision to hold me back. And when I asked her about the high strung comment, she basically said, oh, well, he probably didn't mean it like that. He meant this or that. And I remember thinking at that time, why do you know so much about what he meant if you didn't have any say in my not being promoted. So as things started to unfold and I started talking to others and I started realizing that maybe she had not been in my corner as much as I thought, I I escalated again to my leadership, both my VP that was now running my org as well as my SVP. And during this time, there was a lot of circling around me the female VP, trying to find out what was going on with my case, trying to find out where I was. She clearly knew I was talking to leadership. I assume she was worried, though I don't know because I have not had any contact with her since then. Not that she has not tried, but I essentially told them what happened. I had told them that part of the reason why I never went to my male VP is because I believed that he was part of the problem based on my conversations with her. That I knew that things had changed shortly after he had arrived, even though I did not have any interaction with him. And I just told them the truth. I told them the truth about what she knew. And I basically told them I won't ever know what she informed you of and what she didn't. But this is what I shared with her. And I have a lot of evidence of those conversations because some of them were in writing. What I will say is that action was taken so that I did get a brief for this next couple of months. For the next 6 months, things calmed down a bit. I was still very much recovering from what I had gone through, but things were not as awful. I finally felt like I had a VP who was actively trying to get me projects and trying to, I think, bring me back to life. And I'll always forever be grateful for him because I think that he genuinely, while he never said this, like it's not like he was coming to me saying, oh yeah, like, let's take down the company or you're so right or anything like that. It was more just like he just cared. He just put in the effort to try to give me projects to try and include me. And it goes a long way when you're going through something like this. And it was so nice to have that break. And then layoffs happened again. And during this time, though, the other woman that I mentioned who had come forward, she was going through a much more difficult time. She did not have the same relationships with the leadership that I had gone through to kind of raise my concerns. And her director was actively retaliating against her, not doing one-on-ones with her, excluding her from projects. She felt it's not my place to tell her story, but she had her own stuff going on. And she was part of the layoffs that happened in February. And at that time, I also found out that the VP I mentioned that had been helping me and had been stepping in to help was also part of it. And then I also looked at the numbers and I found that there were a lot of women laid off again, including, ironically, the 2 women specialists in the field in the segment above mine. And I could not believe that I had raised concerns about it the year prior. And then it happened again the next year. And I don't know. I still have no words. And I'm sure like there's plenty I could get in trouble for even saying this, but at the end of the day, like it is what it is. It happened. So I don't know. I just don't understand it. Anyways, one of the males that was laid off who had told me that my previous director had told him to watch out for me, not knowing I had a relationship with him from mentoring him years earlier, had posted about the company being racist and sexist and was getting a lot of people talking negatively about him internally and dismissing his claims. And I was really upset about that because I do know that the reason why he was talking about some of those comments was from my situation. And I felt the need to say something because I did not want this to be swept under the rug. At this point, I had been fighting for, I don't know, like 17 months or something, 16 months. And I just felt somebody had to say something because then I had just seen another female peer get retaliated against. I had seen everyone try to brush it under the rug, and I just didn't want them to brush it under the rug anymore. So I basically didn't condone everything that he had said in the post, but I did share that like at least the part about some of the inappropriate comments was my story, and he was not hiding it. Now he eventually removed that post for fair reasons, wanted to move on with his life, and so eventually my post that had reshared it eventually went with it, of course, because you can't reshare a post that no longer exists. But the retaliation started again after that. I don't know. I'll never know if the retaliation would have started again regardless. Um, the reality is, like, I posted the one thing. It wasn't like I had said that I posted the one thing, and I don't know if that is contributing to it. All I know is that once the VP left, I was no longer able to do my job. Um, I was actively being left out of meetings. I was actively being left. My director whose segment I was supporting, who had previously been retaliating against the female that was laid off, was now refusing to meet with me during one-on-ones, even though he met with my counterpart, even though I explained that there was reasons for us needing to meet, even though I escalated to my director multiple times. And I was still being told I was a problem. I was still being told, well, Heather, why don't you go to this offsite, try to make things right? The reality is I didn't go to the last offsite I was invited to, because the second to last one at sales kickoff, I spent every waking moment I could in my room crying because I felt utterly alone and defeated, and I just didn't know what I was doing there anymore. Mediation had failed, so we had tried mediation with the company in December. Can't reveal a whole lot of details about that, but it failed. I didn't personally feel like, both sides were willing and active participants in terms of wanting to really find a middle ground, but I'm sure they would say otherwise. But that being said, that had failed, or was clearly about going to fail at this point. We had done it in December, and um, I was just alone. I felt very alone at the sales kickoff. And so the idea of going to a second onsite when a director and his managers, at least one of his managers, is refusing to meet with me seemed awful. Why would I go and subject myself to that? And that's exactly what I said. Um, when I got promoted in May, or I'm sorry, in early April, I was given a 5% raise, which was less than the year before when I had not been promoted. And my understanding was that the minimum was supposed to be 8%. When I went to the HR business partner about this, I was just told she'd look into it. I never got an answer back. So who knows? Maybe they'd say they changed the policy, though. I think it probably should matter whether or not they changed the policy the year prior when I was originally withheld or held back. But um, I knew I was being paid less than my peers just from conversations, quite a bit less. And so I knew that when I received my compensation, I still had not been made whole. I still had not been brought up to where I should be. And I also knew that there was more budget because they gave a very large raise to somebody on my team. And I couldn't help but feel like there was a message there in terms of there was budget to give you more. We just chose to funnel it all to this one person. Even that person was surprised, and don't get me wrong, he was excellent. I'm so glad that he got it. I will never fault anyone on my team for getting, their due, and I don't have anything against that. It was more that it couldn't help but have it feel a bit personal that my raise was lower than what the expectation would be, and somehow there was, enough to give somebody else who they knew I would see directly. Like, they knew there was not, like, I was not going to have any idea somebody so much more. But um after that, I was very disappointed. I was disappointed in the current director I had, who I no longer felt was going to do anything to step in or deal with the situation. I was upset with just the company in general, and I no longer felt protected. I was telling my attorneys, like, I can't do this anymore. I was extremely depressed during this time. Like, I'm not going to go into all the details about where I was at mentally, but like, I had to leave. Like, this was a very bad time and place for me. Um, and so I did. And so I found myself crying the following Tuesday because a manager refused to meet with me again. And not only did he refuse to meet with me, he just, like, would not show up and would not respond to my messages. Like, he would just blatantly ignore me. And the kicker is that when I put in my 2-week notice, he chose to decline every meeting invite, just clearly to send a message. So if there's any doubt on whether or not I am exaggerating the retaliation, there was every chance they had to make sure I knew. I think, various people took it. Anyways, I found myself crying again. My husband and I were talking, and he was like, Heather, you just need to go. I mean, he knew how dark of a place I'd gotten to when I went to FMLA, and I think he was worried that we would get there again. And so he was right. It was time for me to go. And I put in my notice the next day. I posted about my departure on May 1st, and that is when I went viral. And that is, I assume, why anyone here is watching this story. But there isn't much more to say about that. Since then, there has been other people that have left that have caused harm. But again, this is all in the past. I'm ready to move forward, but people should know, like, this is essentially what it looks like. So if you watch the first few videos, that's what it looks like to start realizing and coming to terms with the fact that this is in fact discrimination. And then this final video kind of tells you what happens when things spiral out of control, when you know that this is discrimination, and you are now just in this process, this fight. You're just trying to survive, I guess is what I would say, is you go into survival mode. So there's a lot of color I could be adding in here, but again, I just really don't want to relive that. So hopefully this helps provide some clarity. Sorry, it's a bit rambling, but I wanted to post it for anyone who is actually interested in this story.